So the last few things I want to cover before we wrap up this first section on mesh editing tools is the bevel and the inset tool. So let's start with bevel. I just have a default cube here and I'm going to tab into edit mode. And I'm just going to show you what a bevel does. So I can select an edge on this cube or any multiple edges and hold Control and press B and drag out my mouse to create a bevel. Bevel is useful for creating these interesting sort of angled cuts, and you can get some very cool, dynamic shapes with it. You can bevel, again, as I said, multiple edges by just making a multi-select with Shift or dragging out a box selection, and Control B, drag it out, and the bevel will scale, it will bevel these uniformly. So bevel is really great for rounding out corners. Like, say you're working on something that has a really cartoony style, like a 3D animated film. And for this, you want all the objects in your scene to be sort of soft and rounded. Now, beveling is a great way to achieve that. So if you have something that cube, for instance, you could tab into edit mode, select the edges that you wish to round out. In this case, we're just going to have them all selected. Press Control B and drag it out. Now, it's performed this bevel operation, but obviously this isn't round like I was talking about. So just like the other operations and tools we've been looking at, bevel has this contextual bevel menu down in the bottom left corner. So click on that and we can pull up some advanced options for bevel. Now, some of these are very advanced, so we're not necessarily going to cover every setting here. I just want to draw your attention to where it says segments right here, where it says 1. Now this is similar to the number of cuts we were looking at with the loop cut tool. So by increasing this, we are telling Blender how many times to perform this bevel operation, and you can see that increasing it just a few steps has added a lot of detail here and rounded this corner out. So this can give you some nice soft corners, and of course we still have flat shading enabled right here, so we can, in object mode, right click and shade smooth the way we did before, and that's how you get these nice rounded soft sort of objects. Now, just sort of a note about edges and corners in 3D models. There's a little trick that you can do with beveling that will just massively improve the look of any hard surface object that you make. So you'll notice that when you look at just the primitive cube in Blender, these corners and these angles are very harsh and they're very exact because they're coming to like a single point in space, and it is just not very realistic. Real objects, even fresh out the factory, do not have edges that are this sharp and this exact. So it's just physically impossible. And so when you look at something that does have that, it doesn't look realistic. And it's just not very pleasing to the eye. So we can aid this by using bevels. So we're going to tab into edit mode, and with everything selected, let's just hit Control B and pull this out just a little bit. Now it's remembered from my last bevel operation that I had 4 segments. So I don't want 4 segments in this one. We're just going to knock this down to 1. So when you keep a bevel small on an edge like this, it no longer reads to the eye as like a rounded surface. It will appear 90 degrees from a distance. So if we tab into object mode and we zoom out, we can see that this edge is just a lot more easy to read because there's more of an angle of a surface for the light to bounce off of it, basically. So just to compare it to a default cube, we're just looking at these edges here, and you can just see that this one is just more pleasing to the eye, and it is easier for our brains really to parse this information and say, okay, this is a cube. It is just easier with the beveled edge. So just keep in mind, that's just a little trick you can do that just is relatively small, but will just massively improve the aesthetic value of your pieces. So that is all I wanted to say for bevel. Now the last tool I want to go over is Inset. And Inset achieves something that we kind of did with the Extrude tool. So when we were looking at the Extrude tool and we were making that column, we created an inset by pressing E and then S, scaling it in and clicking. So this is achievable with the Extrude tool, but this is much quicker with the Inset tool. Let's just Control Z to undo that and select this face. And now instead of pressing E, I'm going to press I on my keyboard. And sorry, my cursor was a little too close to the center, so Blender just got a little bit confused. No worries, if that happens, just reselect, undo, reselect it, and make sure your cursor is farther out from the selection. So now when I pull this in, you'll see it creates the same kind of inset, but it just does it much quicker. So when we can achieve this with an extrude function, why do we need the Inset tool? It's a great question. And the Inset tool is more valuable when you're coming in on more complex operations than a single inset. So if I wanted to inset every face of this cube, if I were to do that with Extrude, I would have to select a face, extrude, scale, click, extrude, scale, click, and repeat that process all the way around the cube. The insets, as a result, would probably not be very even. And if I tried to do multiple extrusions at once by selecting selecting all of my faces with A, pressing E and S, well, what's happening, it's more clear in wireframe, is basically it's extruded every face, but since all these faces are connected, practically what that means is that it's duplicated this cube, and now I'm just scaling another cube inside this cube, which was not what I wanted. So let's delete this inner cube by pressing X and deleting the vertices. So to achieve what I wanted, we're going to use the Inset tool. So we're going to select all with A and press I for Inset, and at first you'll see that nothing happens. Move this timeline down a little. That is because the individual faces are not being inset, because the individual setting on the Inset tool is currently off, which you can see in the bar up here. Now to turn this on, all we have to do is press I again. And now you'll notice when you inset it, it's insetting properly on every face. Now, this individual setting is also accessible after you perform the operation in the Inset Faces menu that appears in the bottom left corner of the screen. There's a couple other advanced settings here. We'll go over boundary in a future video, but you can play with these to kind of see what they do, but they're more advanced, so let's just stick with individual being the only setting we're going to cover in this. So now from here, you can use things like extrude and scale to create, different forms. So that is all I'm going to cover for this first mesh editing tools section of the course. We're going to be doing a larger scale demo utilizing all these functions and layering them with the things that we have gone over in previous videos to build out a scene. So without further ado, let's move on to the demo.